Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go, the official podcast of Washington Policy Center. I'm David Bose, Communications Director. This episode features audio from our Westside breakfast held at 7:30 in the morning on February 21st at 13 Coins on South King Street, Seattle. It's part of our new breakfast series, which alternates locations between Seattle and Bellevue. For the latest event, just go to our events tab at washingtonpolicy.org. Featured speakers at this event included Finne, the director of our Center for Education, Mariya Frost, director of our Coles Center for Transportation, Todd Myers, director of our Center for the Environment, and our vice president of research, Paul Guppy. You'll also hear remarks from the president of the Washington Policy Center, Dan Mead-Smith.
Of those 2,500 bills, approximately 2,430 of them are about the environment. So it's a little busy right now. I'm just going to talk about three issues real quickly. So the voters voted against Initiative 1631, which was the carbon tax initiative, pretty overwhelmingly, 57-43. The lesson that the majority in the legislature took from that is that people really want a carbon tax. And so they're trying to do that in a variety of ways. One is sort of an end around to deal with CO2 emissions from transportation fuels, and it's called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, they can make it sound very complex, but basically what it is simply putting more biofuel into gasoline. So currently we have a mandate in Washington State of about 10%. When you go, you see the little sticker that says 10% is ethanol. Basically this would take this up to about 15%. Beyond 15% gets dangerous because it's what's called the blend barrier, which makes it cars can't deal with it very well, actually do damage to cars. So the way they can get beyond that is that they do a system of credits, similar to California, where if you electrify your fleet or you turn your fleet into natural gas, they will calculate the amount of CO2 you reduce compared to gasoline, and they'll give you credits, and those credits can be traded. So that's the proposal that they have for Washington State. They want to reduce the carbon intensity of fuel by 20% over the next 20 years. So what does that mean? Well, in California, they have this system already. They have reached the 5% barrier, 5% goal. And they were asked, how much does this cost? And they said, well, it doesn't add anything to the cost of a gallon of gas. There's no evidence that it's added anything to the cost of a gallon of gas. And they said, well, how much does it cost to reduce a metric ton of CO2? Because that's the metric of effectiveness. If you want to reduce CO2, how much does it cost you to achieve that goal? And what they said is $190 per metric ton. Now that doesn't mean anything to people other than people with beady eyes like me who look at this, and that is incredibly expensive. In the Northeast, it costs $5. So California right now is paying $190 to achieve what they can achieve in the Northeast for $5. The legislature, this was the supporters who said it was $190 a metric ton. The other thing about that is gasoline has a consistent amount of carbon. Every gallon of gas produces about 19 pounds of CO2. So when you say, here's the price per ton of CO2, you are saying, here's the price per gallon of gas. And the amount that they said, $190 a metric ton, is 17 cents a gallon for the first 10% reduction, and then another 17 cents a gallon for the second 10% reduction. So they are admitting that it costs 17 cents a gallon to reduce this, which is very expensive. Despite that, it moved forward. What was interesting is that there was a new Democrat freshman, Sharon Shoemate, who is from Whatcom County, who is an environmental economist at the university there. She asked how much it cost, and they told her, and she voted against it. She was the one Democrat to vote against it because she knows that this is a bad idea, very expensive, a bad way to reduce CO2. Even if you want to reduce CO2, doing it this way is very expensive. So that has gotten out of committee. It'll go to the floor. My guess is that they'll move it. I don't know we'll see what happens in the Senate. If that's not enough, they also want to add on a carbon tax. So there are a number of carbon tax proposals, some of which Mariya will talk about. But we expect what's called a cap and trade proposal to be dropped by Reuven Carlisle. Reuven is the Senate chair of the Environment Committee. And it basically, the outline is 1631, which is the initiative we just voted against, but instead of a straight carbon tax, a system called cap and trade. Cap and trade is even worse than a carbon tax, because what it does is it puts arbitrary caps on the amount of CO2 that you can emit, and then the prices fluctuate under that depending on how easy it is to meet that cap in a given year. Everywhere this has been tried, the price swings are huge. They go up and they go down. This was the Kyoto Protocol, if you're familiar with that, in Europe that they used, and what you saw there was the price swings go up and down, and it got so bad that most of the countries under the Kyoto Protocol didn't meet the targets because the targets were too tough. Germany, which was one of the countries under the Kyoto Protocol, their emissions are actually going up now because they realize that they can't meet these targets, they're too strict. So rather than just a straight tax, which is at least predictable, we now want to add something that is even more costly and unpredictable after the voters just voted against something. Lastly, I'll talk about orca and salmon. So last summer, we've talked about, people were talking about orca, and the fact that there hasn't been a new orca calf that has lived in 3 years. That actually has just changed. They're the first orca calf that has survived. It was just born a couple of months ago, so that's good news. But prior to that, every orca calf that had been born for the southern resident population had died. The reason for this is very clear. There's a number of different reasons, but the primary reason is simply that they're starving. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough Chinook, which is what they eat primarily. So the governor did his orca task force and came out with a number of recommendations. Some of those recommendations are very good. In fact, there was bipartisan support for a bill by Jamie Herrera Butler, who's the Republican congresswoman from Southwest Washington, to reduce the population of seals and sea lions at the mouth of the Columbia. There's estimates that the seals and sea lions at the mouth of the Columbia are eating up to 40% of the fish coming out of there. And what happens is that the fish coming out of the Columbia do go up the coast. They go to Alaska, but some of them come into Puget Sound and are food for the southern resident population. The other thing that they talked about is increasing hatchery production. Hatchery production has gone down every year for about the past 10 years, primarily because many in the environmental community don't like hatchery fish. That's all fine. There are some arguments about genetics, but the orca are starving, and we know that hatchery is one of the fastest ways to get them more food. Lastly, there are some projects that we can do to help recover salmon habitat. And we sort of took the unusual step of actually arguing for an increase in the salmon recovery budget. Washington State has $6 billion more in this biennium than it did last biennium just for growth, without new taxes. The governor's budget for salmon recovery is actually lower than 4 years ago. So despite the fact that we have all this rhetoric about caring for salmon, we have lots more money, he actually asked for less. So we said, no, that doesn't make sense. The one thing that we do in salmon that we have gotten to the point that we don't do in climate policy and some other environmental areas is we actually have a ranked list based on science. Fisheries biologists get together and say, look, here's the habitat that is needed. We know what works, we know what doesn't work within margins of error. They're right, there's nothing's perfect. And they rank them. And so we know if we put money here, we're probably going to have success. We don't do that for climate policy. And so that's why I was comfortable in saying that if we spend more money in this area, given the massive amount of new revenue that we have without new taxes, that it will have an effect. So that's what we've promoted. A number of different things. Dealing with seals and sea lions, increasing hatchery production, and spending a little bit more on habitat restoration. So that's sort of where we are on that. And I don't know who's next, so I'm just going to call on Mariya since I know she's going to speak as well.
So good morning. Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me back there? Okay, great. So I'm just going to highlight a couple things that we're dealing with at the legislature this session, namely sound transit and the transportation budget. That's, of course, not an exhaustive list, but those are the two I want to talk about today. So on sound transit, a lot of the same legislation that was brought up in 2017 and 2018 is here again because the legislature, well, really because sound transit has refused to provide tax relief to those people that are currently being overcharged on their car tab renewals who live in the Sound Transit taxing district. And so Senator O'Ban has dropped legislation that would establish a credit program to give refunds back to those folks who are still paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars on their car tab overcharges. It's good legislation, and I'm glad that he brought it up again, even though he's not in the majority, and I don't know if it'll get a public hearing or not. But the conversation needs to continue because the public is still very frustrated, and they feel unheard and ignored by Sound Transit, which actually could provide that relief without any legislation at all. Another bill that he has would require Sound Transit to receive additional approval from voters if they exceed the $54 billion that was approved in ST3, or if they add or subtract from the original project scope. I think that is a very principled bill and represents good policy as well. Additionally, there's a bill that would allow counties to nullify through referendum the taxes that they pay to Sound Transit. In other words, to have a choice. And part of the reason that he's proposed this bill is because he's from Pierce County, and Pierce County, as you may know, rejected ST3, but they're still paying the same taxes that everybody else is, largely to boost light rail in King County. And then finally, and this is a bill that we actually support because it's been a long-standing recommendation of the Policy Center, is his bill that would make Sound Transit be governed by a directly elected rather than an appointed board. Right now the board is appointed by 3 county executives. 9 of them are appointed by Dow Constantine in King County, and so that is a lack of representation that a lot of people in the district feel. And some of the pushback that I've heard is, well, if we have 11 districts, which is what Senator O'Ban's bill proposes, where people would have to have 11 different elections for members on the Sound Transit Board, it would be very political. But our argument is that it's already very political, and people have no recourse. And so any kind of move toward democracy, towards representation, is a move in the right direction so that we can give people power back over the board and how they spend our dollars. And as you know, this has been a rough few years for Sound Transit, really a PR nightmare, as they've had billions in cost overruns and reports of delays, particularly for Linwood Link. So that represents very good policy and something that we have supported for many, many years and will continue to do so. This year, Senator O'Ban actually has 2 Democrat co-sponsors, Senator Conway and Senator Palumbo, so that shows progress, I think. And then 2 other things I'll mention on the Sound Transit front. There is a $420 million class action lawsuit that was filed by Joel Ard on behalf of 7 taxpayers that seeks to challenge the way that the law was written by Sound Transit that allowed them to collect the additional car tab tax that they received in ST3. And so it's different than the bills that are being proposed that would give credits to taxpayers, because he actually is disputing whether it was written constitutionally at all. If he wins, they would have to strike the tax altogether. So he has that court hearing actually happened in September, and he has appealed it. And Sound Transit and the state have responded just on Monday, so just a few days ago. So now the Division II Court of Appeals has been briefed, and we're just waiting for a court date, and it'll be in Pierce County again. And then lastly, we have the $30 car tab initiative that would come before voters in November. So that's all that's happening on the Sound Transit front. Sound Transit and their lawyers and accountants have a lot on their hands, which is good. And then the last thing I'll talk about is the Senator Todd's proposed 2019 transportation package. It started out at $10 billion over 10 years, and now it's ballooned to $17 billion over 10 years. So it's actually quite a bit larger than Connecting Washington, which was $16 billion over 16 years. And so I want to go through just a couple of the taxes and fees that he's proposing in the transportation budget. The big ones for us are the 6-cent gas tax increase and the $15 flat rate carbon tax, which comes out to about 13 cents per gallon. So not counting what Todd talked about with the low carbon fuel standard of 17 cents, this combined would be an additional 19 cents per gallon of gas that you pay on top of what we already pay. And as you know, we pay the third highest gas tax in the nation at 67.8 cents. So of that 19 cents, 13 cents of that, which is the majority, because it's a carbon tax, because it's not protected by the 18th Amendment, would be diverted to other transportation uses. And so some of that includes, 44% of that includes the money that would go to fish passage barrier removal, so culverts. The rest of it, the great majority of that carbon tax revenue, would go toward WashDOT's local programs and public transportation. And so bike and pedestrian projects, safe routes to schools, complete streets, commute trip reduction, transit coordination, bus and bus facilities, right? This is another diversion of really fuel tax dollars from the public. And I would say if you want to increase the gas or the carbon tax, I guess the gas tax is a carbon tax, but the reason I think they're going after a carbon tax in part is so that they could tax drivers in such a way that would allow them to spend that money on whatever they want, because it's not protected by the 18th Amendment. Additionally, there's a statewide transportation impact fee, so $2.50 per square foot for commercial buildings, $1 per square foot for residential and manufacturing buildings, a sales tax increase on auto parts, a sales tax increase on bikes, a sales tax increase on rental cars, an increase in your electrical vehicle fee, which, as you recall, in 2016, that was already increased to $150, right? So he's proposing an additional increase on top of that, and then a variety of other tax and fee increases. I'm a little bit concerned about the transportation budget, largely largely due to the carbon tax and what it seeks to fund. That's over $7 billion from the public over 10 years, and not from the public, from drivers that wouldn't go to highways or anything really that benefits them directly. And so those are just a couple of the issues that I'm covering, and I'm happy to take any questions after.
Morning, my name is Finne. I'm the Director for Education at the Washington Policy Center, and I'm going to start with the bad news and end up with the encouraging news. So in Olympia, just like you heard from Todd and Paul and Mariya, in education, they're looking for ways to increase our taxes. They've already increased public education spending by 69%. We have a new study out that's not in your packet because we published it yesterday, but it tracks how they're justifying an effort to remove limits on local levies. As you recall, this is all boring and technical, but the McCleary decision was from the court was to require the state to increase school funding and put a limit on local levies, okay? And so I have in this lovely new paper that we just published, I have a chart showing how much money the state has now increased for public education since the McCleary decision in 2012. Public schools funding from the state, total funding for education has grown from $10,000 per student to $14,500 per student. So a $4,500 increase in a short period of time since 2012. So that's 7 years. That's a tremendously fast increase for any effort of government. And so what they want, of course, is they've placed a limit on local levies in 2017. The legislature passed this huge increase and put a limit on what school districts can ask local taxpayers to pay. And of course now the legislature wants to remove that limit. So how they're justifying doing that is, of course, I was watching very closely to see, and I've written up how they justified doing that in this paper, which I recommend you read because it takes your breath away. The superintendent of public instruction has now made the sweeping statement that the McCleary decision did not stand for what it stood for, which is breathtaking enough. And then he has 8 superintendents come forward to claim that their budgets have been cut and that they have to have local levy lifted, and otherwise children will be hurt and children will not graduate from high school. So I took the names of these superintendents whose budgets have increased Seattle's budget has increased 65% since the McCleary decision, and they're claiming that they have a $40 million shortfall in their budget. And we all know that they've developed these shortfalls by overpaying their teachers and creating a budget deficit. So this is like a game now. It's gotten very tough. These people are not behaving like you'd expect educators to behave, but this is what's happening, sadly. And I'm watching carefully the bill that appears to progress, which is Senate Bill 5313, which is trying to remove this limit on local levies. And here in Seattle, I was on the Seattle channel debating the new effort to increase and to pass an operating levy by Seattle. And Seattle has asked for twice what the limit allows, and yet the people have passed it. So of course they're running down to Olympia saying, look, Seattle is willing to pay double what the limit allows. You must lift the limit. So you see what's happening. So that's the bad news. I'm trying my best to get the dollars out to the media so that the media reports this honestly. But of course the media narrative is schools don't have enough money. We need to pay more and more and more and more. So it's an uphill battle, but it shows why Washington Policy Center is so important, because even the media is a little bit worried about my saying News Tribune is reporting such and such. They don't like that. They want it. So I do see a check on the media from our very existence, because they're worried about reporting dollars now. They didn't before. Before it was all about give us more money. So that's the sobering news. I'm doing the best I can to get out the facts. But the good news is that charter schools are growing, and I'm doing the best I can to shame the Democrats into providing equitable funding for charter schools. Charter schools do not get local levy funding at all. They are discriminated against in terms of budgets in this state. It's a disgrace. Of course, it's true across the country. But why should we not be the first to treat charter schools equitably and give them local levy funding and capital funding? Charter schools have to raise their own. They have to fundraise to put shelter over the children in their schools. Washington has now 12 operating charter schools, and a new one is opening in South Seattle in the fall. And there's 1,000 students on charter school wait lists. And since the court last October declared charter schools to be constitutional and integral part of Washington's education system, I have noticed a real reduction in the left's attacks on charter schools. So that is a real, and the notion of parent choice, that is what I feel to be the most exciting development and positive development. And then I'm going to end with, and I'm doing the best I can to talk about programs that would actually give parents power over the money, so that they could take that money that the state provides to educate their children and put their child in a private school, especially for the most needy populations of students, like especially in Florida. You should see what's going on in Florida. They're giving parents vouchers to go to private schools if they have kids that have special needs. They have choice galore, parent choice galore in Florida. We should have more parent choice in Washington State. So I'm doing what I can to educate the legislators about what's happening in Florida. It's not happening here yet, but it will happen, and I can tell you why. Because, and this is how I'm going to end, yesterday on NPR, I heard them reporting about the strike in West Virginia. And you may have heard, the teachers are striking again in West Virginia. And they're particularly mad because the Republicans there have included in the bill to pay teachers more, allowing the state to open 7 more charter schools. 7, that's just a tiny number. 7 more charter schools, and to create an education savings account, which would give parents the opportunity to have control of the money and take their kid to private school. And I couldn't believe it. I heard this on NPR. The word education savings account came across the radio waves. In the past, they wouldn't dare to say the word, and so I count that as a victory. That is what think tanks do, and we're excited to get NPR to say the word education savings account. So every time you talk about education policy, please talk about, it's very simple, it's very easy to rationalize. No one can argue with you. You win the argument. Why should parents have the chance to choose the school that their child attends? Parents get to choose everything else about kids. what is the most important thing that a parent can do for a child? Educate them, prepare them for the world ahead. And they can't choose the school that their kid is assigned to. And that is a wrong that needs to be corrected, and it will be. That it's going to take many years, and it's going to take a lot of effort, and it requires everyone talking about parent choice and education savings account, and putting pressure on our elected representatives to pass one of these bills. Thank you.
All right, so if Todd, Paul, Lee, and Mariya could come back up, and I should have mentioned when we started, this is your first breakfast event. It's really meant to be an interactive discussion. So we have a short program from our policy directors, and then open up for questions. So questions on these issues, or we can also answer questions on other legislative issues. We have 3 other senators that are not here, so there's lots going on just from these 4 plus the other issues. So Kathy, you got a question?
Today's the first spring training game, so if you want to ask about that.
Yeah, that's easy.
Please.
Education and my question for Rose. So you said it's $14,500 per child?
Yes.
Okay. That surprised me, it's not low, actually.
That's on average.
Okay.
So in Bellevue, there'll be more.
And I think we should talk about that. I think we should say what the range is.
Oh, in Seattle, it's $18,000 per student, their budget right now. So the range is from about $12,000 minimum to $18,000. And the average is $14,500.
We should say that, just so people
Okay.
understand how big that is. Although, like the local private school,
Yes.
private school is, and I start to think, I go to this school, which is not really like 10% rate.
Yes.
And yet, the state price for, college or whatever, I can send over to this school, this
Yes.
10% going off to lower schools. I think that's our argument, that it needs to be higher.
Yes.
I called Chris yesterday, to tell him I got the information that under the new law,
Can you speak up? I can't hear you very well.
under the new law, when they're supposed to track vision, near
Oh.
vision testing, they're using zero data. Zero data is not my idea of tracking. So it's consistent, but it's not a good idea. So I just want you to know that that's what
Thank you for letting me know.
and he hasn't come back yet, by the way. But, and then, I don't know who this goes to actually, but, I'm really a huge roads movement. And, that is something that I think the county has 11.25% medical rate. We are the lowest by far. Next two counties are 28, everybody else is 43. So because of the annexations of the GMA, we have no money. And 6 years from now, there will be $0 for roads, announced by the budget chair of the county. And things are in a crisis in the low time. But I think that announcement a few months ago was a crisis. I think that law should be changed. When there is a county that goes below 25% medical rate, it must be a county-wide tax.
Can you repeat that one more time, but louder? If there is
If the
below.
annexation level is, if there's unincorporated citizens make up less than a quarter of the county, that there must be a countywide tax paid for the infrastructure of the unincorporated area. So if it were in a city, if it was the second largest city in the state, we have 3% of the revenue, which is long first. So how do we get, how would you suggest that we get the legislature to pass something that is aligned with GMA, that the unincorporated areas must be sustainable?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for you right now. I'd have to definitely look into that. But yeah, no, let me think about that.
And then-
That's too obvious for me, but
And also to add to your question about on per student funding, one thing that we've noticed in the past few years as Lee has done these calculations is that the per student funding at public schools has surpassed the tuition at many private schools. So right now, $14,000, which is the average in public schools, is more than enough to pay the tuition at many private Catholic schools or independent schools. And so public schools are actually receiving more money than most private schools are.
So Kathy, just to make you feel better, as you know, my father is a Redmond city councilman, and Redmond is underinvesting in their capital projects as well. So everybody's doing it, not just the county. So.
Redmond Road's much better than mine.
Yep. back.
Mariya, what is going on in the legislature, if anything, about fixing I-405 tolling?
I'm so glad you asked. I really wanted to talk about it, but I didn't have time. Yes, he's asking about I-405 tolls. So happy you asked. So there's actually a public hearing today on Senate Bill 5825. That is a bill that was proposed by Senator Hobbs, and then the companion to that with Representative Finne, who's the chair of transportation in the House, is 1899. And those are titled as toll authorization bills for I-405, 167, and 509. And for 405 specifically, it's a toll authorization for the expansion of tolls south of Bellevue down to Renton. Well, what the bill does is far more than authorize the tolls. It makes them permanent. And the way that it makes them permanent is by striking the speed requirement. And the speed requirement, so there's there was a big promise that lawmakers and DOT made to the public when they first started that toll project, which is that the tolls would generate enough money, not generate, the tolls would take enough money from. Paul's right behind me. It's triggered. No, that they would take enough money from drivers to cover operating costs, and number two, that they would operate at 45 miles per hour, at least 90% of the time over the course of that pilot. Well, as we know, they're generating gobs of money for DOT, but they're completely failing drivers. And no matter what DOT says and what the measurements are, whatever, the speeds are failing, and people are stuck in gridlock every day on 405. Well, rather than looking at alternatives, they're looking to make those tolls permanent. And the way that they're going to make them permanent is by striking that speed requirement so that they never have to be held accountable to meet that metric ever again. And back when the pilot ended, or should have ended in September of 2017, they said, no, actually, we didn't mean that we need to meet both of these metrics in order to the pilot end. We need to fail both, which is actually technically impossible. And then they had Attorney General Ferguson affirm that in an unofficial opinion, if you can recall. But I think that they know they're on shaky ground. They know that there might be a lawsuit. And so they're going to strike that from law so they never have to deal with it again. And in addition to that, they're going to strike the language in the bill, if you look up the bill 5825, that actually has that promise written out. If after 2 years these tolls are not meeting these two metrics, they will be terminated as soon as practicable. That language is struck from the bill as if that promise was never made to the public. And this is why people don't trust public officials and government in general, because these promises are meaningless. It's very frustrating. And then lastly, the bill directs the money from the tolls, instead of going to the 18th Amendment protected motor vehicle fund, to the state treasury, which tells us that they want to dig the knife in a little deeper and take that toll money and spend it on whatever other corridor efficiencies that they want, which is just gov speak for transit. So that's what's happening with the tolls.
What is the net that they take in tolls for 405 now?
I think over the course of the 2-year pilot, it was pretty close to 40 million, I think. And at 35% of that just went to administration alone, which is abysmal. So this is a failing system, and they are expanding and making permanent a failing system. It's a travesty. And so this is something that I'm working on a legislative memo right now, actually, to get this to lawmakers and alert them and say this is not just a toll authorization bill. I called Senator King directly, and I alerted him to this. And so this is far more than that. This breaks a major promise to the public, and it's a terrible bill. So that's that.
So I'll be looking forward to seeing that draft.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not sure I have a question, but here's some data points. I was in a lunch meeting. I belong to many different associations. One is an IT association I work in. And I was at a lunch meeting with a bunch of CIOs, and the new state CIO was there, and that was an interesting conversation. But the deputy director of OFM was there talking about the potential budget. And he was so proud to state the budget is now past 50 million, and we moved into new territory. And that's forming my question when the guy across the room brought up, says, what are you spending all that money on? All that extra money? They said, oh, we have an increasing population and increasing programs. And me, I formulated a different question. I said, so tell me about this concept of rolling back sales taxes and why the capital gains tax is not an income tax. I just wanted to see what his answer was. Well, he truly believes the rollback of sales taxes will never happen. And he had all this nonsense about it's not a capital gains tax, it's not an income tax, it's an excise tax, which verifies, but even at OFM. But then I said, but it's a very unstable tax. And he says, how so? And I said, you can't count on that revenue, right? You can't put it in a budget. It varies.
As California discovered.
Right, up and down.
And he says, and it was interesting. This was a new concept to him that was unstable. He didn't know how to answer that question. So it was interesting. I didn't have time to go into detail because we're like this.
But so two accomplishments we have is one is Jason has been very successful over the last couple of years, in fact, of just permanently establishing this idea that a capital gains tax is an income tax. He contacted the treasurers of all 49 states. He wrote to the IRS. And we've noticed in the media that it is just taken as a given. It's a framing of the issue has been created by Jason just automatically without any attribution to us, which is fine, that a capital gains tax is an income tax. And that appears to be the major force that is stopping that from happening. The second thing is quickly is that I had the same question from a Q13 Fox reporter yesterday, which was, and she was very neutral, so it was fine, but she just asked, well, shouldn't the budget go up because there's more population coming into the state and you need more public services? And my answer was, when people come into the state, they're taxpayers, so they're not a net negative, they're a plus to the state. So when the population grows, okay, the tax revenues go up, and that's how you can have room for cutting the tax rate while overall revenue is coming in. So every time a big government person says population is going up, so the government, we need to raise taxes. The answer is population is going up, so we should be able to cut taxes because there are more people contributing. Go ahead.
On the issue of the sales taxes and income tax, in your packet is our ad on the IRS, because not only did Jason send it to every state, which is impressive enough, we also got a statement from the IRS saying that a capital gains tax is an income tax. And we did an ad in the Seattle Times, which I think is in your packet.
Yeah. And do you know who the biggest advocate for not relying on capital gains taxes? Governor Jerry Brown.
Yeah.
So Jason has written about Governor Jerry Brown advocates to not rely on a capital gains tax for your budget because of his experience in California. So of all people, Governor Brown is saying capital gains tax is not a sustainable source. Yeah.
I do not envy people in California.
Exactly.
Fair?
Their population fell for the first time.
Yep. Yep. No, you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to thank my friend Paul Berger for inviting me to him. I'm not currently a member, but I'm going to rejoin until I can't sleep well at night. It's glorious to be amongst so many policy wonks, and I mean that in the best way. So I have so many questions. I'm going to try to limit it to three. First of all, what is the fallout or the consequence of the whole independent contractor cosmetology people that came to Olympia?
Yeah.
And I'm here there's going to be a new iteration.
Right.
The second one is, second question. I'll follow up. I'll give you my second.
So I do environmental stuff, but a few years ago I was so outraged by the challenges of small independent business owners, that the barriers to being in business, particular occupational licensing. The cosmetology bill was slightly different, which would basically ban individual stylists from running their own business, right? Choosing their own hours, renting from somebody and saying, here's how I want to run my business, and would force them to work for somebody else. Okay. The argument was, well, they have to pay unemployment. But that's nonsense. If you don't, right, I used to own a small business. If I didn't sign up for unemployment, I didn't get unemployment when I lost my job. So it's a risk they take. They're not paying into the system, but they're not taking out of the system. So it was a BS argument. The reason was the unions wanted to force them into business and then unionize them. That was why they did it. So they were taking away freedom. The beauty of that is that it was organic, right? All these hairstylists said, you're driving me out of business. And they got to see who was really on their side. On occupational licensing, we just had a hearing yesterday that I testified on about reforming occupational licenses. I'll just give you one example. With me was a guy named Kim Long, who was a leader in the Vietnamese community in South Seattle. He came over from Vietnam. He served in the military in Vietnam, fought with the United States, and then came here as a refugee. He was an engineer. To become an engineer in the United States, all you had to do was take a test, because he'd been an engineer in Vietnam. If you're a manicurist in Vietnam, you come here and you have to do 600 hours of training and spend several $1,000s. It is easier to become an engineer in the United States from Vietnam than a manicurist, okay? Totally ridiculous. So we have worked on this issue to try to reduce the occupational license barriers for people who have skills or who are low skill and want to get skills. So I think that what that did is raise awareness of this larger issue of individuals who want to work for themselves, who want to control their own hours, but are being blocked by one rule or another. Regulation favors the rich. It is ironic that the left adds more regulation and talks about how we're the ones who favor the rich. No, the people who can deal with regulation. Regulation is not good in many cases. But if anybody can deal with it, it's the rich, not the poor, and they're locking out the poor. So this isn't it. I'm really glad that happened. I think it gave legs to the work that we're doing on occupational licensing. I can tell you that there were more heads nodding yesterday in the hearing than there were when I started this 2 years ago, and I think that's part of it.
And just real quick, it also shows you the power of going to Olympia and making your voice heard, because a lot of these issues you might say, oh, there's nothing we can do about it, but when 1,000 beauticians came to Olympia, the Democrat chair of the committee just took the bill back. I mean, it was done. So people can make a difference. And there's a lot of bad things happening in Olympia, but if you show up and make your voice heard and articulate some of our messaging, it really can have an impact. We make a point of getting the event over right at 8:30, and we're a little bit over already. I know you had a quick question, so do you want to ask that real quick?
Yeah.
And then we'll just wrap up. But our folks will stay around. And yeah.
Well, first I love the idea of when people ask you why, how can you pay for a tax reduction? Which is, we're not, wait a second, you're spending our money, and I love that. I'll use that with my friend's text chain. So they're all liberal, but so I had a question on one of your articles. You talked about I think the Senate Democrats maybe filing an amicus brief about the capital gains not being a sales tax to the Supreme Court. And are we, our legislators, or is somebody filing an amicus brief in telling us that it is a tax?
Yes, yeah, so we're engaged in that. And again, I'll refer to Jason, our expert on this, is tracking the income tax case, which comes out of Seattle. So it's a Seattle city income tax. It was enacted by the city council. It was immediately challenged in court. That is now, the lower court has already ruled against Seattle.
Right.
So now that income tax case has gone to and also another victory for us was the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court refused to take the case on a fast track basis. So they turned down immediate decision and said, no, the appeals court needs to consider it. So those two actions by the court are positive for us, that the income tax will probably ultimately be struck down. But it is still in process. Jason is following it very closely. And in answer to your question, yes, we are presenting that alternative legal argument. There are actually 3 strong reasons as to why local income tax is not permitted in our state. I won't go into the details. But we are working with legal people to present that argument. And we're confident we're going to win.
And that's the theme of our next breakfast.
Yeah,
so
there we go.
Matt McElwain is our speaker. Great segue. So in March, our event is in Bellevue, and Matt McElwain is a fantastic speaker. We'll be talking about the sale income tax issue. So one thing I didn't mention when I mentioned our marketing campaigns is that in addition to what Dave's doing with our targeted ad campaigns, he's also producing some great animated, you heard of Prager University videos. So hopefully you've seen our Washington Policy Center videos. They're all between 60 seconds and 2 minutes. And I think on every issue we cover today, there's a short video that you can watch and share with folks. So it's another way for us to get our message out, again, in like 60 seconds, a minute and a half max, on explaining what some of these issues are to people who don't want to read a policy brief or an op-ed. So we're looking at different ways to get our message out. Thanks for being here this morning. Thanks for coming out to our first Seattle breakfast. Tell your friends about it. It's hopefully you enjoyed the event. We'll be in Bellevue in March. We'll be back here in April. Rob McKenna will be our speaker, and we look forward to seeing you at that event. And we also have another event coming up with Philip Howard, who's a New York Times best-selling author of The Death of Common Sense. He's a fantastic speaker. We had him several years ago. He'll be speaking April 3rd, again in Seattle, right across kind of the parking lot here at the Silver Cloud Stadium. And we're looking to do more events in the Seattle area, so thanks for coming out.
That concludes this episode of Washington Policy on the Go. Be sure to tune in next week when the podcast features audio from our Farm to Free Market dinner. You'll hear the presentation of Dr. Peter Kuriva, who explains why the real science behind the Lower Snake River dams does not call for removing the dams, and he explains why some scientists are pushing that agenda anyway. If you enjoyed this podcast, we hope you'll review it and share it with friends. Thank you for listening.